Thanks, Sarah, and thank you guys for being here. I actually mostly work on machine learning for socially impactful problems, but recently we got pulled into this project that was super fun about trying to understand how new data sets and artificial intelligence, so basically looking at satellite data, remote sensing data, can give us a view into trying to make supply chains more sustainable. And the particular problem we did was in collaboration with a company called Global Fishing Watch, and they're really interested in seafood supply chains. And this is joint work with Joanne at MIT. So seafood, I'm actually vegetarian, so I had to learn a lot about this. Turns out to be the world's largest employer, like a whopping 260 to 800 million workers. But at the same time, the supply chain is really fraught with environmental and social abuses. So about 20% of global fish catch, and this is a conservative estimate, is caught illegally through IUU shipping. So that has obvious implications for overfishing, marine protected areas, and so on. And then on the labor side, there's a lot of systemic forced labor and human trafficking that's actually staffing these ships, right? These aren't exactly the most desirable jobs. They're not well paid, and it's especially bad in Southeast Asia. So a survey in Thailand, fishermen basically found that 87% of them, which is huge, suffered some kind of labor abuse, right? So withholding of pay, physical abuse, and other threats, other kind of problems. And a lot of why people think this happens is because there was a New York Times journalist who actually went on one of these ships to understand the culture. And what's happening is that these ships, they're kind of in the middle of the Pacific Ocean because we're doing high seas fishing because we've overfished everything near the coast. And so for efficiency, these vessels are out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for like 6 months, a year, 2 years, right? So they're very far from civilization. They're very far from recourse for these individuals, very far for law enforcement, and so on. And one practice that's kind of enabling this kind of behavior is something called transshipments, right? So a vessel's in the middle of nowhere, it needs to get supplies, and it needs to get that frozen, caught fish back to land, right? You don't want to eat fish that's 2 years old, presumably. And so a smaller supporting vessel will kind of go out, meet with the vessel, transfer, do this exchange of goods and individuals sometimes, then come back to shore, and that way that main vessel can kind of stay out in the middle of the ocean for such a long time, right? So there's been a lot of interest in kind of trying to understand, should we be allowing these practices? Can we even do anything about it? Because if it's happening in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for a long time, we really just couldn't monitor it, right? We have no visibility into what's going on. So this was actually a tongue-in-cheek comic. It's actually sad, but now I find it funny. But there's a lot of infographics that you'll find about how to launder illegally caught tuna into the US market. It's super easy. Anybody can do it. You just have to rely on transshipments, right? And these create a lot of opacity in your supply chain. You really have no idea if your fish is coming from a marine protected area. You don't know if it's coming from a place where there are regulations and so on. Right? So what's really cool now is that we now have ice from space. That's how Global Fishing Watch calls it, and I think it's cute. So they actually analyzed over 32 billion real-time AIS tracking signals. So these are remote sensors that are placed in every vessel that's kind of on the high seas to avoid maritime collisions. And doing that, they basically were able to identify 47,000 transshipments. So each red dot on this map is like a transshipment that they think happened. How do they find this? They basically look for two vessels that are hanging out for 48 hours right next to each other, going at essentially 0 speed. And you're kind of what are they doing? Well, they're probably transshipping, right? You can also look at regions of the ocean where you're not supposed to transship and where you are allowed to transship because there's weaker regulations and so on. Another really cool data set that I think is really cool, thank you, is the Visible Infrared Imaging Radiometer Suite. So the ocean goes dark at night unless there's a fishing boat, and then there's a fishing lantern, and then you can see there's a boat there, right? So this is the coast of Southeast Asia. You can actually see, using the light patterns, how much activity is going on. You can see there's a lot more at the coast, but then even as you kind of go out pretty far, over 200 miles, you can see that there's quite a bit of activity, right? So you can use that to control for various things like how many people are actually in this area. Okay, so mainly I want to sell the data because I think it's really cool. We looked at a policy question, but I think there's lots of policy questions that you can look at this space. Now that you actually have visibility, you can answer all kinds of things. The question that they came to us with is, do these transshipments bans work, right? So a lot of buyers are very worried about these labor harms and environmental harms. So they're like, if we just ban this from our supply chain, will that do anything, right? A priori, most people are very negative about it because they were like, we can't see them, so like, why would anyone stop it? And would it cause more bad behaviors? Like, will vessels like turn off their remote sensing technology? Will they basically just evade areas that have higher regulations and so on? And you can actually answer these questions because now we can see the transshipments, right? So it did reduce transshipment rates. It didn't lead to any bad additional behaviors as far as we can tell. And it seems to have had a little bit of an economic impact. So it reduced some fishing activity and increased landing prices a little bit. So there's like a little bit, so now we can try to start understanding what levers buyers and policymakers have to reduce social environmental harm in exchange for slightly more inefficient supply chains, right? So I think it's an exciting time. Susanna's satellite data example was actually kind of cooler, but I think there's lots of things that you can do in this space. Thank you.